As a millionaire gets ready to take his heart medication, a poor little girl approaches and warns him, "Sir, the lady hid your new medicine." He laughs it off, but when he looks at the box she hands him, his heart races. The pills look exactly like the ones he takes every day, but the packaging reveals something terrifying. What seemed like a harmless prank turns into a moment of pure terror. What happens next leaves everyone in shock. The morning arrived shrouded in dense clouds that seemed to mirror the weight Edward Morgan carried on his shoulders. From the 40th floor of his corporate building, he watched the city stretch out like a grey chessboard, where every move could mean victory or defeat. At 58, he had built a financial empire that few dared to challenge, but lately he felt as if he were fighting invisible enemies. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his Italian silk tie. Once again, that strange sensation washed over him, a subtle dizziness that made him question whether he was just overly tired or if something deeper was wrong. The memory lapses had become more frequent, small oversights he attributed to the stress of managing so many responsibilities. After all, commanding an empire demanded sacrifices, and he had always been the first to accept that price. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan." The smooth voice of Helen, his executive assistant, cut through his thoughts like a sharp blade. She appeared at his office door with that calculated efficiency he so admired, carrying the silver tray with his morning coffee and his heart medication. "Your first meeting is in an hour. The merger documents are already on your desk." Edward nodded, observing her with renewed attention. Helen had joined the company only 4 months ago, but had quickly made herself indispensable. She organized his schedule with military precision, anticipated his needs before he even voiced them, and maintained an impeccable professional demeanor. There was something about her dedication that intrigued him. It was almost excessive, as if every gesture were carefully rehearsed. "Are the pills fresh?" he asked, a question he had never posed before. Helen smiled, that perfect smile that never seemed to reach her eyes. "Of course, sir. I always ensure you receive the best possible care." She placed the tray on the mahogany desk and took 2 steps back, keeping her hands clasped in front of her. "Will there be anything else?" "No, thank you." Edward picked up the white pill between his fingers, examining it for a moment. It looked identical to the others he had taken for years, but something in his mind whispered discomfort. Perhaps it was just paranoia. A byproduct of decades navigating treacherous corporate waters where trust was a luxury few could afford. As Helen retreated with silent steps, Edward noticed movement in the corner of his office. Little Sophia, the daughter of Maria Garcia, the cleaning lady, was quietly playing with some colored paper she had found. The 7-year-old girl was a constant presence in the mornings, accompanying her mother to work, and Edward had grown accustomed to her quiet company. Sophia was different from other children he knew. Her large, dark eyes seemed to absorb every detail around her, as if she were constantly learning about a world that was foreign to her. She wore simple but always clean clothes and carried herself with a dignity that contrasted with her evident poverty. She never asked for anything, never bothered him, just observed with that childlike curiosity that reminded him of when he himself was discovering the mysteries of the business world. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she murmured, using the affectionate yet respectful title she had naturally adopted. Her voice was low, but carried a warmth he rarely encountered in his professional environment. "Good morning, little one." Edward felt his lips curve into a genuine smile, the first in weeks. "Has your mother started her work yet?" Sophia nodded, turning her attention back to the papers. Edward watched her for a moment, feeling a strange sense of peace. Amid all the complexities of his life, the simplicity of that child was like a refuge. She represented everything he had lost on his journey to the top, the ability to trust, to see the world without constant suspicion, to find joy in the small things. But at that moment, as he brought the pill to his lips, Edward couldn't imagine that this same child, with her innocence and sharp observation, was about to become the key to unraveling a conspiracy that threatened not only his fortune, but his very life. The next few hours passed in a strange haze for Edward. During the meeting with the Japanese investors, his mind seemed to disconnect for a few seconds, as if he were watching everything through a fogged-up window. When he came to, he realized everyone was looking at him expectantly, waiting for an answer to a question he hadn't heard. "My apologies," he murmured, wiping a hand across his sweaty brow. "Could you repeat the last point?" The ensuing silence was embarrassing. Edward Morgan never asked for something to be repeated in a meeting. His reputation had been built on his ability to absorb complex information and make swift, precise decisions. Seeing those men exchange concerned glances was like a punch to the gut. Hiroshi Tanaka, the head of the delegation, leaned forward slightly. "Morgan-san, we were discussing the payment terms for the second installment. You seemed distant. Just reflecting on the implications," Edward replied, forcing a confident smile. "You know how cautious I am with investments of this magnitude." But inside, panic was mounting. This wasn't normal. The memory lapses were becoming more frequent, and now they were happening at crucial moments. Was it possible that the stress was finally taking its toll, or was there something more serious happening to his health? After the meeting, Edward returned to his office with less steady steps than usual. Helen was already waiting for him with a cup of tea and 2 pills arranged on a small porcelain dish. "And I noticed you seemed a bit tired during the presentation," she said, with apparent concern. "Perhaps it's best to take your medication a little earlier today, and I've prepared some chamomile tea to help you relax." Edward looked at the pills. One was his usual heart medication, but the other was different, smaller, with a slightly yellowish tint he didn't recognize. "Is this one new?" he asked, pointing to the smaller pill. "It's a vitamin supplement your doctor recommended at your last checkup," Helen explained readily, "to help with fatigue and improve concentration. Remember you mentioned the memory lapses?" Edward frowned. He didn't remember mentioning the memory lapses to Helen, much less going to a doctor recently, but perhaps it was another one of those blackouts that had been plaguing him. "Of course," he murmured, picking up both pills, but something made him hesitate. A primal instinct, forged in decades of high-stakes negotiations, whispered a warning in his mind. It was at that moment that Sophia appeared at the door, carrying a small bucket as she helped her mother with the cleaning. The girl stopped abruptly when she saw the scene, her eyes fixing on the pills in Edward's hand. "Mr. Edward?" she said softly, approaching with a child's natural curiosity. "Why does that lady give you different pills?" Helen stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Sophia, you shouldn't be in here when Mr. Morgan is working." "It's no problem," Edward intervened, intrigued by the girl's observation. "What do you mean by different, little one?" Sophia glanced nervously at Helen, then turned back to Edward. "Yesterday, I saw her messing with some boxes in the supply closet. There was a box with a picture of a mouse on it, and she took some little pills from there, too." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward felt the blood run cold in his veins as he processed the child's words. Helen remained motionless, but he could detect a subtle change in her breathing. "Sophia is just confused," Helen said quickly. "Children have such active imaginations, don't they? Perhaps she saw me organizing the kitchen supplies." But Edward was no longer fully listening. The analytical mind that had made him successful began connecting dots that had previously seemed unrelated. The strange symptoms, the memory lapses, Helen's excessive dedication, and now a child's innocent observation about pills from a box with a mouse on it. "Helen," he said slowly, "could you bring me the package insert for this supplement? I'd like to read about the side effects." "Of course, sir. I'll be right back." Helen exited quickly, but Edward noticed that her hands were trembling slightly. As soon as she was gone, Edward knelt to be at Sophia's eye level. "Little one, are you sure about what you saw? It's very important." Sophia nodded with a seriousness that was impressive for her age. "I'm sure, Mr. Edward, the box had a drawing of a mouse, and there was some red writing. Mommy told me that boxes with mice on them are dangerous." Edward felt the world begin to spin around him. But this time, it wasn't because of any medication. It was the shock of discovering that he might be being slowly poisoned, and that a 7-year-old child might have just saved his life. Edward remained motionless after Sophia left with her mother, holding the 2 pills as if they were bombs about to explode. His rational mind tried to find logical explanations for the girl's words, but every justification he devised seemed flimsier than the last. Decades of building a financial empire had taught him that coincidences rarely existed in the world of business. And the intuition that had guided him through countless complex negotiations now screamed deafening alarms. When Helen returned with a paper in her hand, Edward noticed she had taken longer than necessary. Her movements, normally fluid and calculated, seemed slightly rigid, as if each gesture were carefully controlled. "Here is the information sheet for the supplement," she said, handing him the document. "As you can see, it's a very common vitamin complex, recommended for executives facing high levels of stress." Edward took the paper, but his eyes remained fixed on Helen's face. There was something different in her expression, an almost imperceptible tension around her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. Or perhaps it had always been there, and he simply hadn't been paying enough attention. "Helen," he said slowly, "how long did you work at your previous position?" The question seemed to catch her by surprise. "2 years, sir. Why do you ask?" "Just curious." Edward folded the paper without reading it, placing it in his pocket. "And before that, I worked at a few smaller companies. Nothing as prestigious as this opportunity." Her response was too quick, too rehearsed. Edward nodded slowly, then did something he had never done in Helen's presence. Instead of taking the pills, he discreetly placed them in his desk drawer. "I think I'll wait until after lunch. My stomach is a bit sensitive today." He saw a flash of something, irritation, anxiety, cross Helen's face before she regained her professional composure. "Of course, sir. Perhaps that's for the best. Can I get you something for your stomach?" "And that won't be necessary." Edward stood up, walking to the window. "By the way, I need to leave early today. I've cancelled my afternoon appointments." This was a lie. Edward never cancelled appointments, and they both knew it. But he needed time to think, to investigate, to understand what was really happening. The feeling of being hunted in his own territory was suffocating. After Helen left, Edward waited a few minutes before acting. He moved silently to the trash can next to her desk, searching for any evidence that might confirm or dispel his growing suspicions. At the bottom of the bin, partially covered by other papers, he found a small, crumpled box. His hands shook as he pulled it out. The label was partially torn, but it was still possible to read, "Professional-grade rodenticide, danger, keep away from children and pets." And there it was, a small drawing of a mouse, exactly as Sophia had described. The world seemed to stop. Edward sat down heavily in his chair, holding the box as if it could give him answers. The reality was even more terrible than his worst suspicions. Someone was trying to poison him slowly, in a calculated and methodical way. And that person was someone in whom he had placed absolute trust. His mind began working at top speed, connecting symptoms he had attributed to stress, the constant fatigue, the dizziness, the memory lapses. It all made sense now. He wasn't getting old or sick. He was being systematically poisoned. Edward opened the drawer where he had stored the pills and mentally compared them to what was left in the poison box. The size, the color, the shape, they were practically identical to his real medication. Whoever was behind this had meticulously planned every detail. But why? Helen seemed to have no personal motive against him. They barely knew each other before she started working there. Unless it wasn't personal, unless someone was paying her, directing her, using her as a pawn in a much larger game. Edward felt a wave of nausea as he realized how many times he had ingested those pills in recent weeks. How was he still alive? Perhaps the dosage was calculated for a gradual poisoning, something that would look like a natural deterioration of health, a death that no one would question. The phone rang, startling him. It was Helen. "Mr. Morgan, your doctor called to confirm your appointment for tomorrow. He said he'd like to review your current medication." Edward froze. He hadn't scheduled any doctor's appointment. "Which doctor?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Dr. Evans. He said you called yesterday, concerned about the symptoms you've been feeling." "Ah, yes, thank you for the reminder." Edward hung up quickly, his heart pounding erratically. Now he was certain he wasn't just dealing with Helen. There was a larger, more complex conspiracy involving people who knew intimate details of his life and routine. And he was completely alone in the center of a web that seemed to be closing in around him with every passing moment. Edward spent a sleepless night, alternating between moments of panic and cold analysis of the situation. He had secured the poison box in his personal safe, along with the suspicious pills, evidence that could save his life or condemn him if it fell into the wrong hands. For the first time in decades, he felt completely vulnerable in his own territory. The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual. He wanted to investigate before Helen arrived, but she was already there, organizing documents with her typical efficiency. The smile she gave him seemed more sinister than welcoming. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan. You're in early today." There was a note of surprise in her voice that did not go unnoticed. "I didn't sleep well," Edward replied, watching every micro-expression on her face. "I think I'll need those pills earlier today." "Of course, I'll get them right away." Helen left the room with renewed haste, and Edward seized the opportunity to act. He moved quickly to her computer, which she had left unlocked. His fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing browsing histories, emails, and recent files. What he found made his blood run cold. There were searches for symptoms of gradual poisoning, medications that cause memory loss, and how to administer small doses of toxins. Even more disturbing were the encrypted emails in a personal account she had forgotten to log out of. Edward managed to read only fragments before he heard approaching footsteps. As planned, the process is happening gradually. He suspects nothing. A few more weeks and we can proceed with the next phase. "Here is your medication," Helen announced, entering the room. Edward quickly minimized the screen, pretending to check his own calendar. "Thank you." He took the pills, but this time he discreetly slipped them into his pocket. "Helen, I need you to rearrange my schedule. I want to cancel all appointments for the next few days." "That's highly unusual, sir. Is there something specific that concerns you?" The question seemed loaded with double meaning. Edward studied her carefully, looking for signs of anxiety or guilt. "I just need some time to reflect on some important decisions." Later, after Helen left for lunch, Edward made a call to Robert Stone, his trusted private investigator for over 15 years. "Bob, I need a complete and urgent investigation, discreetly. On my executive assistant, Helen." "Any specific problem, Edward?" "I suspect she's not who she says she is. I want to know everything. Real employment history, references, personal connections, financial situation, everything." "Understood. How much time do I have?" "I need the information tonight. It's a matter of life and death." While he waited, Edward noticed that Sophia was playing again in the corner of his office. The girl seemed worried, glancing nervously toward Helen's desk whenever she passed by. "Sophia," he called softly. "Come here, little one." She approached hesitantly. "Mr. Edward, the lady is mad at me." "Why?" "Yesterday, when I went to the restroom, she followed me. She said I shouldn't talk about things I don't understand, that children who gossip can cause trouble for their mommies." Edward felt a surge of indignation. Helen was threatening a helpless child. "Sophia, Did you tell your mother about this? I don't want Mommy to lose her job, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. We really need this job. In that moment, Edward understood the true dimension of the evil he was facing. Whoever was behind this would not hesitate to harm innocent people to keep their plan in motion. A child and her mother were just acceptable collateral damage. Listen to me very carefully, Sophia, he said, kneeling to be at her level. You were very brave to tell me about that box. I want you to know that you and your mother are safe. I will protect you. But the lady said, the lady is wrong, and you're going to keep telling me if you see anything strange, okay? It's our special secret. Sophia nodded, but Edward could see the fear in her eyes. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to carry this kind of burden. When Helen returned from lunch, Edward watched her with new eyes. Every move seemed calculated, every word carefully chosen. How had he been so blind? The signs were all there, the exceptional dedication, the detailed knowledge of his routine, the insistence on the medication. Mr. Morgan, your lawyer called. He said there are some urgent documents that need your signature today. Edward frowned. What documents? Something related to a transfer of authority in case of temporary incapacitation. He said it's just a legal formality. But it needs to be signed while you are, as he put it, of sound mind. Edward's blood turned to ice. A transfer of authority. He had never requested such a document. It was the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. The plan wasn't just to poison him. It was to render him incapable of managing his business, legally transfer control to others, and then he would become completely disposable. "No, tell the lawyer I'll review the documents tomorrow," he managed to reply in a controlled voice. But inside, Edward knew that time was running out. He had uncovered the conspiracy, but he still didn't know who all the players were or how far it extended. And worse, now they knew that he knew. Edward's phone rang at 9 o'clock that night while he was still in his office, poring over financial documents for any irregularity that could be connected to the conspiracy. Robert Stone's voice sounded tense on the other end of the line. "Edward, you need to sit down for this." "Go ahead, Bob. Helen Martin doesn't exist. Or rather, she did. She died 3 years ago in a car accident in Denver. The woman working for you is named Carla Andrade, and she has an impressive criminal record." Edward felt the floor drop out from under him. "Continue." "She's been investigated for fraud in 4 different companies over the last 5 years. Always the same pattern. She gets into positions of trust, manipulates documents, tries to extort executives. In 2 of those cases, the victims suffered unexplained health problems that forced them into medical leave. And how did she get through our vetting process? The references were all forged, fake documents, shell companies. Whoever is behind this invested heavily to place her close to you. Edward, there's one more thing." Bob's pause made Edward hold his breath. "She's not acting alone. I traced wire transfers to her account. $25,000 deposited monthly, always from a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Whoever is paying her has significant resources and knows how to hide money very well." Edward closed his eyes, trying to process the information. "Did you identify the real owner of the company?" "I'm still digging. But I can tell you something that will shock you. The shell company was registered on the same day you announced your new investments in the pharmaceutical sector. Someone knew about your plans before they were even public." The revelation hit Edward like a punch. It meant there was a leak in his inner circle, someone with access to confidential information who was selling or sharing strategic data. "Bob, I also need you to investigate my primary partner, Arthur Sterling. And I want to know who else had access to the information about the pharmaceutical investment." "I'm already on it. Edward, you need to get out of there. If they find out, you know." "I can't. If I disappear now, they'll accelerate whatever plan they have. I need to act like I still suspect nothing." After hanging up, Edward remained alone in his office, feeling the weight of solitude. Who could he trust? How many people around him were involved in the conspiracy? Paranoia began to consume him, but he knew he couldn't afford to succumb to fear. The next day, he arrived early again, determined to confront Helen subtly. She greeted him with her usual smile, but Edward now saw the falsity behind every gesture. "Good morning, Helen, or should I say, Carla?" Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she composed herself. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't understand." "Carla Andrade, born in Miami, not Boston as your resume states, investigated for fraud in Chicago, Dallas, and Denver." The ensuing silence was deafening. Helen remained motionless for a few seconds, as if calculating her options. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely, colder, more calculating, devoid of its feigned kindness. "Impressive. Mr. Morgan, I didn't expect you to find out so quickly. Who's behind this? Who hired you?" Helen laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Do you really think I'm going to give up my employers that easily? You may know who I am, but you're still far from understanding the extent of what you're up against. Then explain it to me. You've upset some very powerful people with your latest investments, people who prefer that certain industries remain under specific control. Your money was starting to shift the balance of power in strategic sectors." Edward began to understand. His recent investments in emerging pharmaceutical companies, especially those developing cheaper treatments for chronic diseases, had threatened established interests. And what was the plan? To kill me slowly. Death would be too obvious. The plan was more sophisticated, to gradually compromise your mental capacity, force a medical leave, and ensure that someone more cooperative took control of your investments. "Arthur Sterling," Helen smiled with malicious satisfaction, "your partner is much more pragmatic than you are. He understands that some sectors are untouchable, that certain battles shouldn't be fought." The betrayal from Arthur, his partner of 20 years, was like a blade through his chest. Together, they had built the financial empire that was now being used against him. "You made a mistake, Helen, or Carla, or whatever your real name is. And what was that? You threatened an innocent child. That gave me the motivation I needed to fight back." At that moment, the door opened and Sophia entered discreetly, followed by her mother. The girl looked nervously at Helen, then ran to Edward's side. "Mr. Edward," she whispered, "the lady was messing with the closet again, and there was a man in a suit talking to her downstairs." Edward knelt to be at Sophia's level. "What man? Little one?" "The same one who sometimes comes to visit you, the one with the grey hair." "Arthur, he was here, probably to check on the plan's progress or perhaps to accelerate the timeline now that Edward had discovered the truth." Edward looked at Helen, who watched the scene with an expression of growing anxiety. The game had completely changed, and now he had enough information to strike back. But first, he needed to protect Sophia and Maria, who had inadvertently become key players in this deadly match. Edward felt the weight of the revelation about Arthur like a stone in his chest, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. 20 years of partnership, of mutual trust, of building an empire together, all crumbling in a matter of seconds. The betrayal from someone so close was almost more painful than the attempted poisoning. "Sophia," he said softly, "you and your mother need to leave here now. Go home and don't come back until I call you personally." Maria, who had remained silent, approached with a worried expression. "Mr. Morgan, did something happen? Did we do something wrong?" "No, Maria, you did nothing wrong. On the contrary, you helped me more than you can imagine, but now you need to stay safe." Helen watched the scene with growing irritation. "Mr. Morgan, don't you think you're overreacting? These are just misunderstandings that can be cleared up." "Misunderstandings?" Edward turned to her with a coldness she had never seen. "Attempted poisoning, false identity, extortion, you call those misunderstandings?" Before Helen could respond, the door swung open and Arthur Sterling entered with his habitually confident posture. Tall, elegant, with his perfectly coiffed grey hair, he exuded the authority of someone accustomed to being in control. But Edward now saw something different in his eyes, a calculating coldness that had always been there, but which he had mistaken for business acumen. "Edward, my friend," Arthur said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Helen tells me you've been a bit, confused lately. Perhaps it's time we consider a temporary leave for you to recover." "How considerate of you, Arthur. 20 years of partnership. And now you show such concern for my health." Arthur maintained the smile, but Edward noticed an almost imperceptible tension around his eyes. "I've always been concerned about you, Edward. That's why I've brought some documents that will facilitate your recovery, a temporary transfer of responsibilities just until you're feeling better. And if I refuse to sign, why would you refuse? It's for the good of the company, for the good of all our employees. You wouldn't want your compromised decisions to harm hundreds of families, would you?" The veiled threat was clear. Edward realized they were willing to destroy the company he had built if he didn't cooperate. Thousands of jobs would be lost, families ruined, all because of his resistance. "Where are the documents?" Edward asked, feigning resignation. Arthur smiled victoriously, pulling a leather folder from his briefcase. "Right here. Just a few signatures and everything will be settled." Edward pretended to examine the papers, but his mind was working quickly. He needed time. He needed a strategy. But most importantly, he needed to ensure that Sophia and Maria were truly safe. "Arthur, how long have you been planning this?" "Planning what, Edward?" "I'm just trying to help a friend who clearly isn't well. Since when did you find out about my investments in the pharmaceutical sector?" Arthur's smile wavered slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about. Companies that develop cheap drugs for chronic diseases, treatments that threaten the monopoly of major pharmaceutical corporations, corporations in which you, apparently, have interests I was unaware of." Helen and Arthur exchanged a quick glance, and Edward knew he had hit the mark. "Edward," Arthur said, his voice losing its friendly tone, "you've always been too idealistic. Some sectors of the economy cannot be disturbed. There are balances that must be maintained. Balances that ensure vital medicines remain expensive, that people die because they can't afford treatment. Business is business. You, of all people, should understand that." Edward looked at the man he had considered his best friend and felt a mixture of sadness and disgust. "You're willing to kill me for this." "No one said anything about killing," Helen interjected quickly. "Just a redirection of priorities." "Redirection," Edward repeated the word with bitterness. "Is that what you call attempted poisoning now?" Arthur sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Edward, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. Sign the documents, accept the medical leave, and we all come out ahead. You'll have time to recover, the company will continue to run, and the investments will be redirected to more stable sectors. And if I refuse, then we'll have to consider other options. You have a family, Edward. Nieces studying abroad, a sister who lives alone in upstate New York. It would be terrible if something happened to them because of your reckless decisions." The threat to his family was the last straw. Edward felt a cold, controlled fury take hold of him. They hadn't just betrayed his trust, they were willing to hurt innocent people to get what they wanted. "You've both made a fatal mistake," Edward said, his voice low but filled with determination. "And what's that?" Arthur asked arrogantly. "You underestimated how far I'm willing to fight when the people I love are in danger." In that moment, Edward made a decision that would change the course of everything. He would no longer be the passive victim of a conspiracy. It was time to fight back, even if it meant risking everything he had built. Edward looked at the documents in his hands and, in a move that surprised both Arthur and Helen, slowly tore them into small pieces, letting them fall to the floor like confetti. The silence that followed was charged with electric tension. "You've gone completely insane," Arthur said, his mask of civility finally dropping. "You have no idea what you've just done." "On the contrary," Edward replied with a calmness he didn't know he possessed. "For the first time in months, I know exactly what I'm doing." As he spoke, he discreetly pressed a hidden button under his desk, a recording system he had installed years ago for protection in delicate negotiations. Every word of the conversation was being recorded and automatically uploaded to a secure server. Helen moved nervously toward the door, but Edward stopped her. "I wouldn't leave if I were you, Carla. Building security has already been alerted to your real identity." It was a bluff, but it worked. Helen hesitated, looking uncertainly at Arthur. "You have no proof of anything," Arthur said, but his voice betrayed a growing anxiety. "Who's going to believe that I, your partner of 20 years, would try to poison you?" "Perhaps you're right about not having enough proof," Edward admitted, "but you made a crucial mistake. You involved an innocent child. And that gave me something I didn't have before." "What?" "Absolute motivation to destroy you." Edward walked to his desk and opened the drawer where he had kept the suspicious pills. "These pills are being analyzed at 3 different labs as we speak. The results came in an hour ago." Another bluff, but the look of panic on Helen's face confirmed his suspicions. "Professional-grade rodenticide, administered in calculated doses to cause gradual mental deterioration. Ingenious, I must admit. If it weren't for a 7-year-old girl, you would have gotten away with it." Arthur tried to regain control of the situation. "Edward, we can still resolve this civilly. No one needs to know about any of this. We can renegotiate the terms." "Renegotiate?" Edward laughed bitterly. "You tried to kill me, Arthur. You threatened my family. You involved a child. What kind of renegotiation do you think is possible?" "One that keeps everyone alive and prosperous," Arthur replied coldly, finally revealing his true nature. "Because if you persist on this path, the consequences will be devastating for everyone." Edward felt a chill, but he stood firm. "What consequences? Do you really think it's just the 2 of us?" "Edward, you're up against a network that extends far beyond what you can imagine. Politicians, judges, other business leaders. If you expose us, they will make sure you are utterly destroyed. Your reputation, your family, everything." The revelation of the conspiracy's scope should have terrified Edward, but strangely, it had the opposite effect. He felt a mental clarity he hadn't experienced in months, as if the fog that had clouded his thoughts had finally lifted. "Then let them all come," he said. "But before that happens, I'm going to make sure that Sophia and her mother are protected, and I will expose every single one of you." "How?" Helen asked with contempt. "You're just one man against an entire organization." Edward smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a genuine smile. "No, I'm not. You've forgotten something fundamental." "What's that?" "I didn't build this empire alone. I have loyal allies, people who have trusted me for decades. And more importantly, I have the resources to protect those who need protecting and to fight those who need to be fought." Edward picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Bob, it's time to implement Protocol Alpha." Arthur and Helen exchanged confused glances, but Edward could see the fear growing in their eyes. "Protocol Alpha?" Arthur asked. "A contingency plan I developed years ago for situations exactly like this. When you have an empire like mine, there are always people trying to tear it down. So you prepare." Edward's phone rang. It was Bob. "Everything's confirmed, Edward. The evidence is being sent simultaneously to the district attorney's office, the FBI, and 3 trusted investigative journalists. The bank records from the Cayman Islands Shell Company have also been obtained. We have everything." Edward hung up and looked at Arthur and Helen, who seemed to have aged 10 years in a few minutes. "You have approximately 15 minutes before this story breaks," he said calmly. "I suggest you use that time to decide whether you want to cooperate with the authorities or flee to a country with no extradition treaty." Helen broke first. Arthur, you said you had everything under control. You said he would never find out. Shut up! Arthur yelled, losing his composure completely. Edward watched the implosion of his would-be executioners with grim satisfaction. But his victory would only be complete when he was sure that Sophia, Maria, and his own family were safe. The tables had turned. Now he was the hunter. The 15 minutes that followed were the most tense of Edward's life. Helen paced like a caged animal, while Arthur remained motionless, clearly calculating his limited options. Edward stayed vigilant, knowing that desperate people were capable of extreme acts. "You don't understand the forces you've set in motion," Arthur finally said, his voice laced with a coldness Edward had never heard before. "This goes far beyond the two of us. There are people who will not passively accept your interference." "Then let them come out into the open," Edward replied. "I'm tired of fighting shadows." Helen's phone rang, a shrill sound that made everyone jump. She answered with trembling hands, speaking in nervous whispers. Edward could only catch fragments. "He knows everything. No, we couldn't. You need to abort." When she hung up, her face was as white as paper. "They're furious. They said you've just signed your own death warrant." "Who are they?" Edward asked coldly. Helen glanced at Arthur as if asking for permission to speak. He gave a short, resigned nod. "A consortium of multinational pharmaceutical companies," she confessed. "Your investments in generic drugs and alternative treatments were threatening billions of dollars in profits. They couldn't let that continue." Edward felt a mix of anger and satisfaction. His intuition about being on the right path had been confirmed in the worst possible way. "And how many other business leaders have you tried to eliminate?" "You were the third," Arthur admitted with brutal honesty. "The other two weren't lucky enough to have an observant child nearby." The coldness with which Arthur spoke of the deaths of innocent people made Edward realize he was dealing with individuals completely devoid of a moral compass. His determination to protect Sophia and her family intensified. At that moment, the door opened and Robert Stone entered, flanked by 2 FBI agents. Edward felt immense relief at the sight of allied faces. "Edward, we intercepted some interesting communications," Bob said, holding up a tablet. "There are more people involved than we thought, including some names that will surprise you." Edward scanned the list on the device and felt his blood run cold. There were names of influential politicians, federal judges, and business leaders he knew personally. The conspiracy was even larger and more dangerous than he had imagined. Mr. Sterling, Ms., or should we say, Carla Andrade, one of the federal agents said, "You are under arrest for attempted murder, identity fraud, and conspiracy." As Arthur and Helen were handcuffed, Edward didn't feel the satisfaction he expected. Instead, he felt a profound sadness for the betrayal of someone he had considered a brother. "Arthur," he said before his former partner was led away, 20 years? How did you manage to pretend to be my friend for so long?" Arthur turned, and for the first time, Edward saw something resembling remorse in his eyes. "In the beginning, I really was your friend, but the money, the power, they change people, Edward. You were lucky enough to keep your integrity. I wasn't." After the prisoners and agents had departed, Edward was left alone with Bob in his office. The silence was heavy, charged with all the implications of what had just transpired. "Bob, I need you to step up security for my family immediately, and I want permanent protection for Sophia and Maria." "Already on it. But Edward, this isn't over. The names on this list, they have the resources and influence to make your life a living hell, even from behind bars." Edward walked to the window, watching the city stretch out below. He felt like a general surveying a battlefield before the decisive war. Then we'll make sure they're exposed and neutralized before they get that chance." "How?" Edward turned, and Bob saw an iron determination in his eyes. "We're going to use the same weapon they tried to use against me, information, but this time we'll use the truth." You're thinking of going public with everything. More than that, I'm going to turn this assassination attempt into a crusade. Every business leader, every politician, every judge involved in this network will be exposed, and I'll use my resources to ensure that vital medicines get to the people who need them, the very thing they tried to stop. Bob smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. You realize this will make you even more enemies, don't you? I do, but I also realize that some battles are worth fighting, regardless of the cost. Edward glanced at the corner of the office where Sophia used to play. The courage of that little girl had not only saved his life, but had illuminated a path to something much greater. Now it was his responsibility to ensure her sacrifice was not in vain. The war had begun, but Edward finally felt ready to fight. 2 weeks after the arrests, Edward found himself in a small apartment on the Upper West Side, a secure location where he had moved Sophia and Maria while the situation stabilized. The girl was playing on the living room floor with new dolls he had bought her, but Edward could see she still carried the weight of the recent events. "Mr. Edward," Sophia said, looking up from her dolls. "Mommy was crying again last night. She thinks we did something wrong." Edward's heart ached. Maria was in the bedroom, talking on the phone with her sister, and he took the moment to speak with Sophia alone. "You didn't do anything wrong, little one. In fact, you helped me discover something very important, but I know all of this has been scary for you." Sophia nodded gravely, with a maturity that pained Edward. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to carry this kind of worry. "Mommy's scared the bad people will come after us. I'm a little scared too." Edward knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his. "Sophia, look at me. Do you remember when you told me about that box with the picture of the mouse?" She nodded. "In that moment, you were the bravest person I have ever met, braver than most adults. And do you know why? Why? Because even though you were scared, even though you didn't fully understand what was happening, you did the right thing. That's true courage." Sophia smiled shyly, and Edward felt a wave of tenderness he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Now I want you and your mother to know something. As long as I'm alive, nothing bad will happen to you. I promise. But what if you can't protect us?" The child's direct, honest question surprised him. Edward realized he needed to be just as honest with her. "Sophia, there are people trying to hurt me because I found out things they wanted to keep secret. But I have powerful friends, good people who are going to help me, and more importantly, now everyone knows the truth. So it's very hard for those bad people to do anything without everyone seeing." Maria came out of the bedroom just then, her eyes red from crying. Edward stood up and approached her. "Maria, I know this has all been very difficult for you." "Mr. Morgan," she said with a trembling voice, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us, but I'm so scared. On the news, they talk about important people being arrested because of what happened. What if they want revenge?" Edward placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maria, you saved my life. Sophia saved my life. Now it's my turn to protect you. But how long will we have to stay in hiding? Sophia needs to go to school. I need to work." Edward had thought a lot about this over the past few days. "I have a proposal for you. I want you to move somewhere safe, permanently. A nice house, in a safe neighborhood, with discreet but effective security." Maria looked at him with suspicion. "Mr. Morgan, I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Edward interrupted gently. "It's justice. And more than that, I want to offer you a job. A supervisor of services at one of my companies, a proper salary, benefits, an opportunity to grow. I'm not qualified for that. You have something more valuable than a formal qualification. You have integrity. And skills can be taught. They can be developed. What can't be taught is character." Sophia had stopped playing and was listening intently. "Mr. Edward, does that mean we're going to have a real house?" "Yes, little one, and more. I want you to go to the best school in the city, a school where you can develop all that intelligence and courage you've shown. But I'm not rich. Sophia, wealth isn't just about money. You have a richness that many people don't, a pure heart and the courage to do what's right. That's worth more than all the money in the world. Maria started to cry again, but this time Edward could tell they were tears of relief and hope. "Why are you doing all this for us?" she asked. Edward thought for a moment before replying, "Maria, I've spent my entire life building wealth, accumulating power. But it was a 7-year-old child who taught me what really matters, protecting the innocent, doing the right thing even when it's hard, and using what we have to help those in need." He turned to Sophia. "Little one, you taught me that true strength doesn't come from money or power. It comes from the courage to tell the truth, even when all the adults around you are lying." Sophia ran to hug him, and Edward felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in decades, he felt that his wealth had a real, meaningful purpose. "Mr. Edward," Sophia murmured against his chest, "are you going to visit us in our new house?" "Whenever you want, little one, whenever you want." In that moment, Edward understood that he had found something he had long been searching for without knowing it. A chosen family. People he loved, not out of obligation or interest, but by genuine choice. And he had also found his true mission, to protect the vulnerable and use his power to create a more just world. A month after the initial arrests, Edward discovered that his victories had awakened even more dangerous enemies. He was in his new temporary headquarters, a smaller but more secure office in Midtown, when Bob arrived with alarming news. "Edward, we've intercepted some disturbing communications. There's a new group trying to regain control of the situation. People who weren't on the initial list." Edward looked up from the documents he was analyzing. In recent weeks, he had dedicated himself to completely restructuring his investments, directing even more resources to affordable drug research and social programs. Who are they? International investors. People with connections in foreign governments. They see you as a threat that needs to be neutralized before you inspire other business leaders to follow your path. Edward sighed. He had hoped the arrests and public exposure of the conspiracy would be enough to deter new attacks, but he had apparently underestimated the extent of the wounded interests. What kind of threats are we facing? Different from before. No more direct attempts at poisoning or assassination. Now, it's economic warfare. They're trying to destroy your companies, corrupt your partners, sabotage your investments. And Sophia and Maria. Secure. But Edward, there's something else you need to know. Bob hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to reveal. Spit it out. They've approached some of your employees, offered substantial sums for information about your activities, your plans, your location. Most refused, but some accepted. 3 people so far. They've already been identified and removed, but it shows they're willing to invest heavily to bring you down. Edward felt a familiar wave of disillusionment. Even after everything that had happened, there were still people willing to betray him for money. "Bob, I want you to implement a new security protocol. Only 5 people will have full access to my information. You, my lawyer, my accountant, my personal physician, and Maria. Maria. She's the only person I trust completely. It's a paradox, isn't it? The person with the least to gain materially is the one who has proven to be the most loyal." Just then, the phone rang. It was a call from a blocked number, but Edward answered it anyway. "Mr. Morgan," an unfamiliar male voice said on the other end. "Ooh, we believe it's time for a conversation. Who is this?" "Someone who can offer a solution to your recent problems. We are prepared to make a proposal that will resolve all outstanding issues." Edward activated the recorder and motioned for Bob to trace the call. "What kind of proposal?" "A mutually beneficial agreement. You cease your activities in sensitive sectors, and we guarantee that your family and your protégés remain safe. Everybody wins. And if I refuse, that would be unfortunate. Accidents happen, Mr. Morgan. Companies fail. Reputations are destroyed. The people we love can suffer unforeseen consequences. The veiled threat made Edward clench his fists, but he kept his voice controlled. Where do you want to meet? That won't be necessary. You have 48 hours to consider our offer. We will be in touch. The call ended abruptly. Edward looked at Bob, who had managed to trace the call's origin. Singapore, Bob said. Definitely international. Edward stood and walked to the window. The city below him was humming with activity, thousands of people living their lives, unaware of the silent battles being waged on the top floors of corporate skyscrapers. Bob, I need to see Sophia and Maria. Today, Edward. That could be dangerous. If they're watching, then let them watch. I will not hide like a criminal while they threaten innocent people. 2 hours later, Edward was at the safe house where he had settled Sophia and Maria. The girl ran to hug him as soon as he arrived, but he noticed she seemed worried. Mr. Edward, Mommy said it might be dangerous for you to come here. Your mother is worried, and she has good reason to be. But do you know what I learned from you? Sophia, what? That sometimes we have to be brave even when we're scared, and that the people we love are worth fighting for. Maria approached, drying her hands on her apron. Mr. Morgan, the news is saying there are still people trying to hurt you. Maybe it would be better for you to stop fighting and accept what they want. Edward knelt to be at Sophia's eye level. Little one, do you remember why you told me about that box with the mouse on it? Because it was the right thing to do. Exactly. And now, would stopping the fight be the right thing to do? Sophia thought for a moment, with the seriousness that always impressed him. No, because if you stop, other bad people will just keep doing bad things to other people. Edward smiled, feeling his heart warm. You're wiser than most adults, Sophia. Maria sighed, clearly torn between her concern and her pride in her daughter. Maria, Edward said, standing up, I know you want me to stop so I can be safe, but if I stop now, everything we've fought for will have been for nothing, and other families like yours will continue to suffer. So what are we going to do? She asked. Edward looked at the two, one woman, one child, who had become his chosen family. We're going to keep fighting, but this time, we're going to be even smarter and more careful. The day after the 48-hour ultimatum, Edward made a decision that surprised even Bob. Instead of hiding, he called a press conference. The hotel ballroom was packed with journalists, cameras, and live broadcast equipment. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, Edward began, his firm voice echoing through the silent room. Over the past few months, you followed a story that began with an attempted poisoning and unraveled an international conspiracy to control strategic sectors of the economy. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. Today, I'm here to tell you the rest of the story, to talk about a 7-year-old girl who had more courage than most adults, and about how her bravery not only saved my life, but exposed a network of corruption that extended far beyond what we ever imagined. In the audience, Edward saw familiar faces, some allies, others clearly hostile. He knew every word was being analyzed, every expression studied. In the last 24 hours, I received a call offering me a deal. In exchange for stopping my investigations and halting my investments in affordable medicine, they would guarantee my family's safety. This is what we call blackmail. A murmur went through the room. Edward continued, relentless. Dull, but there's something these criminals don't understand. We don't fight just for money or power. We fight because there is a little girl who taught me that doing the right thing is worth any risk. We fight because there are thousands of families who deserve access to life-saving medication. After the press conference, Edward returned to the safe house. Sophia was watching television when he arrived, and her face lit up when she saw him on the screen. Mr. Edward, you were on TV talking about me. I was little one. I told everyone how brave you were. Sophia grew thoughtful for a moment. Does that mean everyone knows who I am now? Edward felt a pang of concern. Perhaps he had exposed Sophia too much by mentioning her publicly. Are you worried about that? A little bit. But I'm also happy. Why? Because now other kids will know that they can also help when they see something wrong happening. Sophia's natural wisdom never failed to surprise him. At 7, she intuitively understood concepts that many adults took decades to learn. Maria approached, still nervous about all the exposure. "Mr. Morgan, after the TV interview, a lot of people called here. How did they get the number?" Edward frowned. "What kind of calls?" Most were reporters wanting to talk to Sophia, but there was one different. A woman said she was impressed with the girl's courage and that she hoped nothing would happen to such a special child. Edward's blood ran cold. It was a clear and direct threat. "Maria, you're moving tonight. Bob has already prepared an even more secure location." "Mr. Edward," Sophia said, sensing the tension, "Did I do something wrong by letting you talk about me on TV?" Edward knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his. "No, little one, you did nothing wrong. There are bad people in the world who get angry when other people do good things. But that doesn't mean we should stop doing what's right. So we're going to keep fighting. We're going to keep fighting. But we're going to be even more careful." That night, while helping Sophia and Maria pack again, Edward received an unexpected call. It was from Dr. Eleanor Sharma, a renowned pediatric oncologist at a major research hospital. "Mr. Morgan, I saw your interview today. I want you to know that there are many of us who support your fight. I work with children who die because their families can't afford drugs that cost pennies to produce, but are sold for thousands of dollars. Doctor, I appreciate the support, but Mr. Morgan, you are not alone in this fight. After your press conference, I received calls from over 50 doctors, nurses, and researchers who want to help. We want to form an alliance, a group of healthcare professionals willing to publicly expose how the current system harms patients." Edward felt a surge of hope. "That could be dangerous for you. Mr. Morgan, every week I watch children die because life-saving drugs are kept artificially expensive. If that's not worth the risk, then nothing is." After hanging up, Edward looked at Sophia, who was carefully arranging her dolls in a box. "Sophia, remember when you told me about that box?" "I remember. Did you know that by doing that, you were starting something very big?" Sophia stopped packing and looked at him with her large, serious eyes. "I didn't know it would be big. I just knew it was right. And it's still right. And now we have a lot of friends helping us. Like in a superhero story." Edward smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Exactly like in a superhero story. And you were the very first hero." Sophia smiled back, returning to her dolls. "Mr. Edward." "Yes, in the new house. Are you still going to visit us?" "Always, little one, always." As he watched Sophia and Maria finish packing, Edward realized his fight had evolved. It was no longer just about protecting his own life or his company. It had become about protecting the idea that ordinary people, including a 7-year-old girl, could change the world when they had enough courage to do the right thing. And now, finally, he was no longer fighting alone. The crisis peaked on a rainy Tuesday, exactly 3 months after Sophia had found the box of poison. Edward was in a meeting with Dr. Sharma and other allied physicians when Bob burst into the room, his face pale with despair. "Edward, they took Sophia." The world stopped. Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut, the air escaping his lungs in a painful hiss. "What do you mean, took her?" he managed to ask, though his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. Maria was taking Sophia to her new school. 3 men in a black sedan. It happened too fast for the security detail to react. "Maria's in the hospital. They pushed her and she hit her head, but she's conscious." Edward shot up so abruptly he knocked over his chair. His mind, which had always functioned with analytical control, was in a total panic. Sophia, his little hero, the girl who had saved him with her innocence and courage, was in the hands of people who had shown they had no ethical boundaries. "Bob, mobilize everything. All contacts, All resources. I want her found in 2 hours. Max! Edward, Dr. Sharma said softly, you need to calm down to think clearly. No! Edward exploded, his composure finally shattering. They took a 7-year-old child, an innocent child whose only crime was having the courage to do the right thing. His voice broke on the last word, and for the first time in decades, tears streamed down Edward Morgan's face. All the masks, all the corporate control, all the hardness built over years of ruthless business dealings crumbled in the face of the terror of losing Sophia. The phone rang. Bob answered it immediately. It's for you, he said, handing the phone to Edward with a trembling hand. Mr. Morgan, the same male voice from the previous call said coldly, we hope you now understand the seriousness of our proposal. Where is she? Edward demanded, fighting to keep his voice steady. Safe, for now. She's a charming girl, very polite. She was worried about her mother when we explained she'd been hurt. Edward clenched his fists so hard his nails dug into his palms. If you touch a single hair on her head, we're not interested in harming children, Mr. Morgan, but accidents can happen if we don't reach an agreement quickly. What do you want? The same thing we've always wanted. Stop your investments in generic drugs. Withdraw all support for the researchers who threaten our interests. And most importantly, drop all charges. Publicly admit you were mistaken about the conspiracy. In exchange for what? The girl comes home, your family remains safe, and you can continue to be a prosperous businessman, just more selective in your investments. Edward looked around the room. The doctors watched him with expressions of compassion and anger. Bob awaited his instructions, clearly willing to mobilize an army if needed. I need time to think. You have 1 hour. And Mr. Morgan, remember that children are fragile, especially when they're scared and far from home. The call ended. Edward stood motionless for a few seconds, then erupted in a controlled fury that startled everyone in the room. They want a war. Then we'll give them a war. Edward, Bob said carefully, but we have to think about Sophia's safety. I am thinking about her. Do you think if I give in now, they'll just release her and never bother anyone again? People like this don't make deals. They make temporary concessions until they get everything they want. Edward walked to the window, watching the rain fall over the city. Bob, I want you to track every property, every vehicle, every phone associated with these people. Use every resource necessary. And if we can't find her in time? Edward turned, and everyone in the room saw an iron determination in his eyes that mixed paternal love with corporate fury. Then we do something they won't expect. We give them exactly what they asked for, publicly. I'll call a press conference. I'll admit I was wrong. I'll back down on all the investments. Edward, you can't. And the exact moment Sophia is safely back with Maria, I will reveal everything again. But this time, with even more solid evidence, with more allies, and with a story that will move the entire world, the story of how international criminals kidnapped an innocent child to protect their dirty profits. Edward looked at each person in the room. Are you with me? Dr. Sharma was the first to answer. To the end. Bob? Always, Edward, always. Edward felt a renewed strength flowing through him. Sophia had taught him about courage. Now it was time to show her that adults could be brave, too, when the people they loved were in danger. Then, let's bring our girl home. The rescue operation began with Edward doing exactly what the kidnappers expected, holding a press conference where, with tears in his eyes, he admitted he was mistaken about the conspiracy and announced the withdrawal of all investments in generic drugs. The world watched one of the country's most powerful businessmen humiliate himself publicly. But what the criminals didn't know was that while Edward spoke to the cameras, Bob was coordinating an intelligence operation involving the FBI, Interpol, and private security agents. Every word of the negotiation had been traced, every phone signal triangulated, every movement monitored. Sophia was being held in an abandoned warehouse in Queens, guarded by 4 men who believed they were executing a simple psychological pressure tactic. They never expected that a 7-year-old girl could be important enough to mobilize resources from 3 different countries. During the rescue, Sophia once again demonstrated her extraordinary courage. When the FBI agents stormed the warehouse, they found her consoling one of the kidnappers who had been stung by a bee and was having an allergic reaction. "The man is sick," she told the officers with her usual seriousness. "He has allergies, like the boy at my school. He needs medicine, fast." Even in captivity, even scared and far from home, Sophia had maintained her natural compassion. It was a lesson in humanity that moved even the seasoned agents. Edward arrived at the rescue site before the last of the kidnappers were in custody. When he saw Sophia running toward him, safe and unharmed, he fell to his knees and hugged her with an intensity that surprised even himself. "Little one, are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "No, Mr. Edward. They just wanted me to be quiet. But I missed Mommy and you." "Never again, Sophia. I will never let anything like this happen to you again." Sophia pulled back slightly to look him in the eyes. "Mr. Edward, you did that thing on TV where you said you were wrong. But you weren't wrong. Were you?" Edward smiled through his tears. "No, little one. I wasn't wrong. Sometimes you have to pretend to lose a battle to win the war. Like in the game of checkers you taught me. Exactly like in checkers." 3 hours later, Edward was back in front of the cameras, but this time with Sophia by his side and Maria discharged from the hospital, holding her hand. The second press conference would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in American television. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edward began, his voice now firm and controlled, "a few hours ago I lied to you. I said I was mistaken about the conspiracy, that I would withdraw my investments in affordable medicine. I lied because unscrupulous people had kidnapped this little girl to force me to—" He placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder, who remained serene before the cameras. "But Sophia taught me something about courage. She taught me that doing the right thing is worth any sacrifice. And now, with her safe beside me, I can tell you the whole truth." In the following minutes, Edward presented devastating evidence. Recordings of the kidnappers, calls, bank records showing international payments, connections to corrupt politicians, and, most damningly, the complete list of everyone involved in the conspiracy. "This little girl," he said, looking directly at the cameras, "not only saved my life, but she exposed an international criminal network. At 7 years old, she showed more courage than most adults will in their entire lives." Sophia stepped closer to the microphone. "Can I say something?" Edward nodded, lowering the mic to her height. "I just wanted people not to be sick because they don't have money for medicine," she said with her natural honesty. "My grandma died because she couldn't afford her heart medicine. If I can help other grandmas not die, then I want to help." The silence in the press room was absolute. Many journalists had tears in their eyes. Edward returned to the microphone. "That is why I am announcing today the creation of the Sophia Foundation, dedicated to making vital medicines accessible to all American families. And I'm also announcing that every single person involved in this conspiracy will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." After the press conference, as they were heading home, Sophia asked, "Mr. Edward, is it all over now?" Edward thought carefully before answering. "The danger is over, little one, but the fight for a better world never ends. It's something we do every day, with small acts of courage and kindness. Like when I told you about the little box. Exactly like when you told me about the little box." Sophia smiled and snuggled up beside him on the car seat. "Mr. Edward." "Yes, I love you." Edward felt his heart fill with a happiness he had never experienced in all his business achievements. "I love you too, little one, more than you can possibly imagine." Maria, sitting on Sophia's other side, smiled through her tears. Finally, After months of fear and uncertainty, her family was safe. And more than that, her daughter had become a hero who would inspire other children to have the courage to do the right thing. 6 months after the kidnapping, Edward was in the backyard of Sophia and Maria's new home, a cozy house in a quiet Westchester suburb with discreet but effective security. It was a sunny Saturday, and he had arrived for the weekly lunch that had become their sacred tradition. Sophia, now 8, ran to hug him, wearing the uniform of her new school, one of the best in the state, where she was excelling not only academically, but also for her natural leadership and empathy. "Mr. Edward, look what I made in school." She held up a colorful drawing of a family, a man in a suit, a woman, and a little girl, all holding hands in front of a house with a flower garden. "It's beautiful, little one. Who are these people?" "It's us," she answered simply. "You, me, and Mommy. The teacher asked us to draw our family, and I told her that family isn't just about who has the same blood, it's about who really loves each other." Edward felt that familiar wave of emotion Sophia always stirred in him. In a few short months, this child had completely transformed his understanding of what truly mattered in life. Maria appeared at the door, wearing a new dress and smiling in a way Edward had rarely seen before. It was the smile of someone who finally felt safe and valued. Her new position as a supervisor at the company had revealed administrative talents she never knew she had, and her dedication had impressed all her colleagues. "Mr. Morgan, lunch is almost ready. I made that lasagna Sophia loves so much." During lunch, Sophia chatted excitedly about her school projects. She had started a courage club where kids shared situations where they did the right thing even when it was hard. The idea had spread to other schools in the district. "You know, Mr. Edward," she said between bites, "yesterday a girl in my class was being teased by some boys, and I remembered what you taught me about standing up for others. What did you do?" "I told the boys to stop, and when they didn't, I got the teacher. The girl thanked me later and said she wanted to join the Courage Club too." Edward exchanged a proud glance with Maria. Sophia was naturally becoming the kind of leader the world needed, someone who used courage to protect the most vulnerable. After lunch, while Maria cleared the kitchen, Edward and Sophia walked in the garden. It was a moment he always looked forward to, these private talks where they could discuss profound things with the simplicity only a child can achieve. "Mr. Edward, is the Sophia Foundation helping a lot of people?" "It is, little one. Last month, we provided free medication to over 5,000 families, and the labs we support have already developed 3 new treatments that cost much less than the old ones." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "Does that mean fewer grandmas will die like mine did?" "Yes, it does. And do you know why that's possible?" "Why?" "Because a very brave little girl had the courage to do the right thing, even when it was scary." Sophia smiled, but then grew serious again. "Mr. Edward, sometimes I have nightmares about those bad men who took me." Edward knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his. "It's normal to be scared after something like that, Sophia. But do you remember what you taught me about courage? That courage isn't not being afraid, but doing the right thing even when you are afraid." "Exactly. And you know what else?" "What?" "Those men are all in prison now. They can't hurt you or anyone else. And more importantly, because of your courage, a lot of other people are being protected from people like them." Sophia hugged Edward tightly. "Mr. Edward, do you promise we'll always be a family?" "I promise, little one, forever." At that moment, Maria joined them in the garden, carrying a chocolate cake she had baked especially for Edward. "Ladies," Edward said formally, making Sophia giggle, "I have an announcement to make." They looked at him expectantly. "I've decided I want to officially adopt Sophia, if you both agree, of course." The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Maria began to cry, and Sophia looked with confusion between the two adults. "Does that mean you'll be my real dad?" she asked. "It means we'll make something that's already true official." We are a family, and families protect each other, love each other, and fight for a better world together." Sophia shrieked with joy and threw herself into Edward's arms, followed by Maria, who enveloped them both in a group hug. Months later, on the day of the official adoption, Edward looked at Sophia, now legally his daughter, in the courtroom, and reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. He had started as the victim of a conspiracy, nearly lost his life to poison, but had found something far more valuable than any material wealth, a family built on genuine love and the courage to do what is right. Sophia, in her new dress, squeezed his hand tightly and whispered, "Daddy, can we help even more kids now?" "We can help even more kids now," he confirmed. As they left the courthouse, Edward understood that his life had finally found its true purpose. It wasn't just about building wealth or power, it was about using those resources to protect the vulnerable and create a world where children like Sophia could grow up safe and brave. The little girl who had saved his life had, in fact, given him something far greater. She had shown him the path to a life of real meaning. And as they walked together toward the future, Edward knew the greatest adventure of their lives was just beginning.